Hey guys, tonight we open the book, not on the thunder of tanks or the echo of marching boots, but on a quieter, stranger, chaos, the Germany of 1919. Imagine a nation that has just staggered out of the First World War, like a prize fighter who lost on points, battered, humiliated, and utterly broke. The Treaty of Versailles had slammed down like a heavy gavel, stripping away land, colonies, and pride, and demanding a debt so crushing it was as if someone had asked an entire country to pay their rent in gold bars. Hyperinflation followed, and money literally became cheaper than the paper it was printed on. There are stories, half tragic, half absurd, of children using stacks of banknotes as building blocks, or women wheeling carts full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. If you were there, honestly, you probably wouldn't survive it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in right now, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing how this little community stretches across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The scene is Germany after World War I, and to say things were falling apart would be an understatement. Soldiers had returned home, not to a hero's welcome, but to unemployment lines and empty pantries. The Kaiser was gone, the monarchy was dust, and a fledgling democratic government, the Weimar Republic, was trying desperately to keep the ship afloat while water poured in through every crack. And boy, were there cracks. One mainstream fact that sets the stage: the reparations bill Germany was handed in 1921 totaled the modern equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars. Imagine being told to cough up a mountain of money you don't have, while your factories are silent and your markets are flooded with cheap imports. That's not just an economic problem, that's a recipe for fury. But here's the quirky detail that sticks out. During the hyperinflation crisis of 1923, some enterprising folks used banknotes as wallpaper. It was literally cheaper than buying paint or paste. Historians like to chuckle at the image of entire living rooms lined with devalued currency, as if the walls themselves were bleeding wealth that had turned worthless overnight. And speaking of historians, they still argue whether the Weimar Republic ever truly had a chance. Was it doomed from the start, squeezed between left-wing revolutionaries and right-wing reactionaries? Or was it simply sabotaged, again and again, by the weight of circumstances it couldn't possibly control? It's one of those questions with no final answer, though it makes for endless debate at conferences. Into this shaky stage stepped millions of angry, restless Germans. Veterans especially felt betrayed by the so-called Stabend myth, the claim that Germany hadn't lost the war on the battlefield, but had been betrayed by weak politicians and shadowy enemies at home. This lie festered, spreading blame like a weed, and it created fertile soil for new movements that promised strength, unity, and revenge. Imagine Berlin's smoky beer halls, where working-class men gathered after grueling days of scraping by. The air thick with cigarette haze, the floor sticky with spilled beer. These weren't just pubs, they were political arenas. Every night, different voices shouted, argued, and pitched their vision for saving Germany. One evening, you might hear a communist railing against capitalist greed. The next, a monarchist longing for the good old days of the Kaiser. And sometimes, in the corner, a small, obscure group called the German Workers' Party tried to make its case. Here's the irony: nobody really paid attention to them at first. They were small, almost laughably so. But history often loves an underdog with a dangerous idea. Out of this unstable, beer-soaked political stew, something dark was brewing. And waiting in the wings, a man with no money, no job, and no clear path forward. Adolf Hitler was about to stumble into this chaos. But before he arrived, the Republic kept wobbling. Street fights broke out between rival factions. Paramilitary groups roamed cities, half militia, half gang, wearing uniforms that gave them a sense of purpose. Inflation ate savings alive. Middle-class families watched lifetimes of careful saving turn to dust in months. It wasn't just poverty, it was humiliation. And humiliation, when bottled up, tends to look for someone to blame. The setting sun of the 1920s cast long shadows across German cities. Picture children with hollow cheeks, women haggling over scraps at open-air markets, men scanning newspapers, thick with bad news. Yet also picture jazz clubs, cabaret shows, and an avant-garde art scene exploding with creativity. The Weimar Republic was contradictory, despair and decadence sharing the same street. Adolf Hitler's life before the Nazi Party looked less like the grand sweep of destiny and more like a string of awkward failures stitched together with stubbornness. Born in Austria in 1889, he spent his early years drifting through small towns, quarreling with his strict father and idolizing his mother. But when people imagine the future dictator, they don't usually picture him standing in front of art school gates in Vienna, portfolio under his arm, waiting for someone to declare him a budding genius. Spoiler alert, they did not. He failed the entrance exam to the Academy of Fine Arts twice. One examiner allegedly told him he had talent for architecture, but not pending a cruel twist since he didn't have the required qualifications to study architecture. So, instead of sketching domes and spires, he sank into Vienna's boarding houses, surviving on cheap bread and long bitter rants about politics. The mainstream fact here: Hitler really did spend years as a struggling artist, selling watercolor postcards of Vienna streets and buildings. You might even imagine some poor Viennese tourists buying one, completely unaware they were purchasing art from a man who would one day plunge the world into war. Somewhere, tucked in dusty attics, a few of those postcards still survive. Prize them not for their quality, but for the disturbing signature scrawled at the bottom. Here's a quirkier detail. During those Vienna years, Hitler often lingered at the grandiose Hofapar Opera House, mesmerized by Wagner's operas. He would sit in the cheap seats, soaking in the pounding, myth-soaked music. Later, Wagner would become central to Nazi ideology, his epic tales of Germanic gods serving as both inspiration and soundtrack. Imagine a young, broke Hitler humming along to Wagner on his way back to a cold boarding room, clutching half a stale Pretzelitz, a picture of obsession fused with poverty. Historians still argue about what exactly hardened him during those Vienna years. Was it his immersion in the city's toxic, openly anti-Semitic press? Was it the humiliation of failure, compounded by envy of those who succeeded? Or was he just always predisposed to rage against the world, regardless of circumstance? There's no clear answer, though each biography seems to lean on its own theory like a crutch. When war finally broke out in 1914, Hitler, now living in Munich, seemed almost relieved. He volunteered enthusiastically for the Bavarian army, a chance to escape obscurity and finally belong to something larger than himself. And oddly enough, he wasn't a terrible soldier. He wasn't a commander or a natural leader, yet more like a messenger, darting across trenches with dispatches. He was wounded twice, once in the thigh and later temporarily blinded by gas. He even received the Iron Cross for bravery, something he would flaunt later, like a badge of destiny. Still, he was never the guy in charge. Picture him instead as the quiet, oddly intense soldier who didn't drink, didn't chase women, and mostly muttered about fate while sketching battlefield ruins in the margins of his notebook. To his comrades, he must have seemed eccentric, but harmless. And yet those frontline years gave him something he had craved all along, a sense of purpose. For the first time, he belonged. Then, of course, came 1918, the collapse. Germany surrendered, the Kaiser abdicated, and Hitler lay temporarily blinded in a hospital, listening to the news with disbelief. He later described that moment as if the world itself had crumbled beneath him. For millions of veterans, the end of the war was devastating. For Hitler, it was existential. His one refuge had dissolved into chaos, and he carried that bitterness like a burning coal for the rest of his life. And here's where that cheeky sardine callback slips in. In the hospital, recovering from gas exposure, Hitler supposedly wrote bitter reflections about betrayal, but hospital meals, cheap, uninspiring, and rationed may have included those infamous sardine tins that Germans joked would outlast the Republic. Picture him poking at one, furious about surrender, muttering about destiny, while around him other wounded soldiers just wanted the war to be over. Sardines and destiny. History is nothing if not absurd. The Weimar Republic that emerged from the ashes didn't appeal to him. He loathed democracy, saw compromise as weakness, and seethed against the so-called November criminals who had signed the armistice. By the time he was discharged, Hitler was drifting again, rootless and broke-butt this time, with a dangerous cocktail of resentment and political obsession. It was fate or maybe just chance. By late 1923, Munich had become a cauldron of unrest. The economy was collapsing under hyperinflation. Workers were being paid twice a day so they could rush to spend their wages before prices doubled again. Housewives carried baskets of notes just to buy bread, while children made kites and toys out of banknotes worth less than a single egg. Amid this chaos, extremists of every stripe saw their chance. For Adolf Hitler and the growing Nazi Party, the moment felt ripe for a leap into history. Here's a mainstream fact. Hyperinflation in Germany peaked in November 1923, when $1 was worth 4.2 trillion. German marks, trillion. You couldn't even count the zeros fast enough. No wonder so many Germans felt their world had gone completely insane. The quirky detail. Some enterprising Berliners began burning stacks of money to heat their stoves. It was cheaper than buying firewood. Imagine the irony of a family tossing bundles of banknotes into the fireplace, warming themselves with the ashes of their nation's currency. Somewhere in those flickering flames, the Republic's credibility went up in smoke. Historians still argue whether Hitler truly believed he could seize power in 1923, or if the beer hall putsch was more of an impulsive gamble. Some say he had convinced himself that the German people were ready for revolution. Others argue he simply wanted to copy Benito Mussolini's march on Rome from the previous year. Either way, the plan was audacious: march through Munich, overthrow the Bavarian government, and then sweep into Berlin as the savior of the nation. It all began on November 8, 1923, at the Burgerbier Eukeler, one of Munich's largest beer halls. Inside, Bavarian officials were gathered for a political rally. Suddenly, Hitler stormed in with his SA stormtroopers, their boots pounding, rifles gleaming under the dim gas lamps. Hitler leaped onto a chair, fired his pistol into the ceiling, and shouted that the national revolution had begun. Picture the scene: broken glass crunching underfoot, the acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with beer fumes, and stunned officials staring at a man who looked half-possessed. At gunpoint, Hitler forced Bavarian leaders into a side room and declared that a new government was in place, with General Erich Ludendorff, World War I hero, on board to lend credibility. The problem: not everyone in the room was convinced. Outside, Munich wasn't exactly erupting in support. The Nazis had underestimated how much power still lay with the police and the army. The next morning, November 9th, Hitler and his followers marched into the city, about 2,000 men in brown shirts carrying flags and rifles. They expected to be joined by crowds of Munich citizens. Instead, they were met by armed police blocking their path. For a tense moment, the two sides faced each other in the crisp Bavarian air. Then shots rang out. Chaos erupted, men scattering, bodies falling, the revolution unraveling in a burst of gunfire. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were killed. Hitler himself was thrown to the ground when his bodyguard, Ulrich Graf, tried to shield him. His shoulder was dislocated. His dream of seizing power was shattered. Now here's where that sardine callback fits in again. During the scuffle, one Nazi flag was trampled and later smeared with the blood of fallen marchers. The party would enshrine it as the Blutfahne, the blood flag, using it in ceremonies like a holy relic. And yet, in the immediate aftermath, the Grand Revolution looked less like a triumph and more like a crushed sardine can, battered, dented, and reeking of failure. Hitler was arrested 2 days later, dragged before the court on charges of treason. But here's the twist. Instead of burying his career, the trial turned him into a national figure. The mainstream press covered every day of testimony, and Hitler treated the courtroom like a stage. He didn't defend himself so much as he accused the government, painting himself as a patriot betrayed by cowards. His speeches were printed in newspapers across Germany, suddenly giving him a platform far larger than any beer hall. Historians still debate whether the judges were sympathetic to him or just caught up in the spectacle. Either way, his sentence was surprisingly light: 5 years in prison, though he served less than 9 months. He was even allowed visitors, a secretary, and time to write. And that brings us to the quirky yet pivotal detail in Landsberg prison. Hitler and his fellow Nazis lived more like a fraternity than inmates. They wore their own clothes. In the Munich of 1919, beer halls weren't just watering holes, they were crucibles of politics. Imagine the smell first: a mix of stale hops, cigar smoke, and sweat from men packed shoulder to shoulder after long workdays. Wooden tables were scarred with knife marks and beer stains, and the air pulsed with arguments. These halls doubled as makeshift parliaments, where anyone with a loud enough voice could test out a vision for Germany's future. And into this scene walked Adolf Hitler, not yet the Führer, not yet even the leader of his own party, but simply a man with a fury in his throat. One mainstream fact to ground this moment: on September 12, 1919, Hitler attended his very first meeting of the German Workers' Party in a Munich beer hall. There were only about 25 people in attendance, hardly the stuff of legends. But when one speaker suggested that Bavaria should secede from Germany, Hitler erupted. His rebuttal was so fiery that Anton Drexler, the party's founder, pulled him aside afterward and begged him to join. It wasn't the size of the room that mattered, it was the spark lit inside it. The quirky detail: Hitler's membership card for the German Workers' Party listed him not as member number 7, like number 555. The party, desperate to look bigger than it was, inflated its membership list by starting at a higher number. So technically, Hitler wasn't the seventh original member at all, just another guy buried in an overstuffed ledger. The myth made for better storytelling later. Historians still argue whether this was pure chance or inevitability. Was Hitler simply a lucky accident for the party, a drifter who stumbled in at the right time? Or was his trajectory angry veteran, obsessed with destiny always, going to lead him to some fringe political group where he could unleash his talent for rage-filled oratory? The debate continues, with some scholars pointing out how many similar groups fizzled out without ever producing a Hitler. What set him apart was his voice. It's hard for us, sitting decades later with scratchy black and white recordings, to fully grasp it. But contemporary accounts describe him as magnetic, a man whose speeches could whip a room into a frenzy. He gestured wildly, eyes blazing, his words building like a storm. Even skeptics admitted he could hold attention like a spell. In an era before Netflix, TikTok, or even reliable radio broadcasts, the raw power of a speech mattered more than we can imagine. At first, though, he was just the party's loudest speaker, not its leader. The German Workers' Party was a small tent of nationalist grumblers, scribbling leaflets and holding obscure meetings. They had no uniforms, no banners, no real identity. He pushed for a new name, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP. He sketched out the swastika banner himself, bold red background, white circle, black hooked cross. It was a design meant to punch through the smoky haze of beer halls and shout authority. The sardine callback fits nicely here. The early party had such meager funds that they often passed a literal sardine tin around the tables to collect coins for printing leaflets. Imagine it, speeches about destiny and rebirth, followed by the clinking of pfennigs into a smelly fish can. Not exactly glamorous beginnings for a movement that claimed to be the future of Germany, but somehow it worked. Audiences grew. By 1920, Hitler was no longer just a member, he was the draw. Leaflets began advertising, not the party itself, but his speeches. Crowds swelled into the hundreds, then thousands, curious to hear this firebrand, who spoke like a man possessed. His themes were simple but potent: betrayal in 1918, resentment at Versailles, fear of communism, pride in German strength. He was giving shape to feelings that already festered in the public mind. The cell door at Landsberg clanged shut behind Adolf Hitler in November 1923. But he wasn't entering a dungeon of despair. In fact, he would later call it his university. The irony was staggering: sentenced for treason, yet treated more like an eccentric professor on sabbatical than a dangerous criminal. His fellow conspirators, Rudolf Hess, Emil Morris, and others, were housed nearby. They wore civilian clothes, received visitors freely, and dined together in the prison's common room. If you squinted, it looked less like incarceration and more like an extended nationalist sleepover. One mainstream fact: while sentenced to 5 years, Hitler actually served only about 9 months. The German judiciary, heavily staffed with conservatives, sympathetic to nationalist causes, had no appetite for punishing him severely. Compare this to how harshly communist agitators were often treated, and you see a glaring double standard. Here's a quirky detail: Hitler and his cellmates weren't exactly eating prison gruel. Supporters sent them sausages, cakes, cigars, and yes, tins of sardines. They even decorated their rooms with flowers and enjoyed daily walks. Hitler used the time to dictate his ideas to Hess, pacing back and forth as if delivering a lecture. Hess dutifully scribbled down page after page, producing what would become Mein Kampf. Picture Hess struggling to keep up while Hitler ranted about destiny, racial purity, and architecture, his words spilling faster than ink could dry. Historians still argue how seriously Mein Kampf should be taken. Was it a clear warning of his intentions, a roadmap that the world simply ignored? Or was it, as some scholars suggest, a confused mix of autobiography and ideology that only gained significance in hindsight? Even today, people debate whether contemporaries truly could have foreseen the horrors that would follow just by reading its pages. For Hitler, the writing process was therapeutic. He filled chapters with rants against the Treaty of Versailles, communism, and, most obsessively, the Jewish people, whom he blamed for Germany's defeat and suffering. Yet, between the venom, he also sketched strategies, the need for propaganda, the importance of cultivating a mass movement, and the ultimate goal of securing Lebensraum living space for the German nation. The book was long-winded, poorly structured, and not exactly a page-turner, but it laid down the ideological spine of what the Nazi Party would become. And remember that sardine tin we've been carrying through the story. Well, in Landsberg, Hitler sometimes joked about how far the movement had come from passing sardine cans around Munich beer halls for donations, to now being supported by donors who sent entire hampers of food to their martyrs. It was darkly comic. Failure had made them more famous than success ever had. When Hitler was released in December 1924, he emerged into a changed political climate. The hyperinflation crisis had been stabilized by the Dawes Plan, and the economy was beginning to recover. The revolutionary fervor of 1923 had cooled, but Hitler had learned his lesson. No more wild putsch attempts. The path forward would be legal, strategic, and cloaked in the language of democracy, even while working to dismantle it from within. Still, rebuilding the party wasn't easy. While he was in prison, the Nazi movement had splintered, with rival factions bickering over leadership. Some members doubted whether Hitler could truly bring them to power after such a humiliating failure. But Hitler, with his renewed sense of destiny and his Hofreiten Manifesto, set about unifying the ranks. One of his first acts was to establish strict loyalty to himself. He declared that the Nazi Party wasn't just a political organization, but a movement bound by the will of its leader, him. This wasn't exactly democratic party building. It was closer to a cult, and people bought it. His courtroom theatrics and prison time had elevated him into a martyr, a man who had sacrificed for Germany. For many disillusioned nationalists, that gave him credibility that pamphlets alone never could. The party also began to experiment with new propaganda techniques. Posters and newspapers spread their message with sharp slogans and dramatic imagery. Hitler realized that politics in the 20s. When Adolf Hitler walked free from Landsberg prison in December 1924, he didn't step into a world on fire. Quite the opposite. The flames of revolution that had burned so hot in 1923 were now little more than embers. The Weimar Republic had stabilized its economy through the Dawes Plan. Foreign loans were flowing in, and German cities, though scarred, began to hum again with industry and nightlife. For most Germans, the putschist of yesterday seemed irrelevant in this new climate of cautious optimism. But Hitler was nothing if not adaptable. He understood that another wild coup attempt would get him nowhere. Instead, he recast the Nazi Party into something more disciplined, more professional, something that could play the game of democracy while plotting to dismantle it from within. Here's the mainstream fact. In February 1925, the Nazi Party officially reformed after being temporarily banned. Hitler reclaimed leadership and declared that from now on, the party would pursue power through legal means. "We shall have to hold our noses and enter the Reichstag," he said, sounding more like a reluctant student forced into math class than a revolutionary. The quirky detail: when the Nazis unveiled their new headquarters in Munich, the so-called Brown House, they decked it out with flags, banners, and even a huge swastika carpet. It was part political office, part stage set. Visitors weren't just entering a workplace, they were stepping into a performance of power. One journalist remarked that it felt less like a party office and more like a temple, and Hitler, naturally, was its high priest. Historians still argue whether Hitler's legal path to power was a sincere strategy from this moment on, or simply a tactical pause until conditions allowed another coup. Some suggest he never abandoned dreams of revolution. Others say he had genuinely learned that ballots could achieve what bullets could not. Either way, the result was the same. The Nazis began contesting elections, opening offices across Germany, and grooming themselves as a legitimate political force. Meanwhile, Mein Kampf trickled into bookstores. It wasn't an instant bestseller, though Nazi propaganda later exaggerated its popularity. The book's dense pages and endless rants made it tough going for casual readers. But within nationalist circles, it became a kind of sacred text. Those who did slog through it found a roadmap. Germany's humiliation blamed on Jews and Marxists, the promise of national rebirth, and the dream of Lebensraum in the East. In hindsight, it reads like a warning written in capital letters, but in the late 1920s, many dismissed it as just another rant from a fringe politician. Still, Hitler knew the book was less important as literature and more as a symbol. Supporters proudly displayed it on shelves, like a badge of ideological loyalty. Wedding gifts sometimes included a copy of Mein Kampf, which, if nothing else, must have made for some awkward honeymoon reading. By 1926, the party was reorganized into a pyramid of loyalty. Regional leaders, or Gauleiters, answered directly to Hitler. The SA, the brown-shirted stormtroopers, drilled in the streets and intimidated opponents, giving the movement a sense of muscle. And in a strange twist, Hitler also created a smaller, more elite bodyguard unit, the SS, originally just a handful of men tasked with protecting him personally. At the time, few could have imagined how terrifyingly powerful this group would later become. Let's bring back the sardine callback here. At early Nazi rallies outside Munich, poor rural supporters sometimes donated whatever they had, often not coins, but food. One small-town Nazi branch reportedly sent Hitler a box of sardines as a token of support, which was proudly displayed at a local meeting. Imagine it. Destiny packaged in brine. That's how low-budget the movement still was. Even so, the Nazis' fortunes in elections were modest. In the 1928 Reichstag elections, they won just 2.6% of the vote. Hardly a tidal wave. The Communists had far more seats. So did the Social Democrats and the Conservative parties. For many in Berlin, the Nazis were still a Bavarian curiosity, loud, theatrical, but ultimately marginal. One newspaper joked that Hitler had peaked in a beer hall and would soon fade back into obscurity. But history, as usual, had other plans, because across the Atlantic, Wall Street was wobbling. And when the U.S. stock market crashed in October 1929, the shock wave ripped across the world. American loans propping up Germany's fragile recovery vanished overnight. Factories shuttered, banks failed, and millions of Germans found themselves jobless. By 1932, nearly 6 million were unemployed. And when despair returned, by 1932, Germany felt like a country caught in a tug of war. On one end, the communists promised revolution, waving red flags and chanting about workers' rights. On the other, the Nazis thundered about national pride, waving swastikas and chanting about rebirth. In the middle stood the Weimar Republic, exhausted, battered, and increasingly irrelevant. Voters didn't want compromise anymore. They wanted certainty. And Adolf Hitler knew how to package certainty in goose-step precision. Here's the mainstream fact. In the presidential election of April 1932, Hitler ran against none other than Paul von Hindenburg, Germany's 84-year-old president and a war hero. Hindenburg won, but Hitler secured an impressive 36.8% of the vote in the second round. For a man who, a decade earlier, had been shouting in beer halls, this was staggering. It showed that millions of Germans now saw him not as a fringe agitator, but as a serious national leader. The quirky detail: during that campaign, Hitler zipped around Germany in a small plane, holding rallies in multiple cities in a single day. It was a novelty. Few Germans had even seen an airplane up close, let alone a politician using one like a taxi. His campaign posters proudly proclaimed, "Hitler over Deutschland, Hitler over Germany." Imagine looking up into the sky and being told that your candidate was literally flying above you, a symbol of modernity and destiny rolled into one. It was propaganda genius, and it dazzled crowds who were otherwise stuck in breadlines. Historians still argue whether Hitler's appeal at this stage was more about him personally or about the collapse of faith in Weimar democracy. Was he truly charismatic enough to pull in millions on his own? Or did people simply latch onto him because all other options seemed exhausted? Some say his speeches were mesmerizing. Others point out that Nazi success often tracked directly with economic misery. In other words, was it Hitler the man, or just Hitler the moment? Meanwhile, the street battles escalated. The SA, Hitler's brown-shirted paramilitary, clashed constantly with communist militias. Gunshots cracked through alleys, fists flew in marketplaces, and ordinary citizens found themselves caught in the crossfire. For many Germans, it felt like civil war simmered just beneath the surface. And in that climate, Hitler's promise of law and order sounded appealing, even though his own stormtroopers were often the ones breaking the law and causing the disorder. And here comes the sardine callback again. During a 1932 election rally in Hamburg, Nazi organizers reportedly distributed little sardine sandwiches to attendees stamped with swastika wrappers. The symbolism was clear: simple food for simple people, offered by the party that understood the common man. It was propaganda by picnic, and while it sounds ridiculous now, it helped build that sense of community the Nazis thrived on. Despite setbacks, Hitler's political momentum built. In July 1932, the Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag, yet Hindenburg, the old field marshal, refused to appoint him chancellor. He reportedly dismissed Hitler as that bohemian corporal, a sarcastic jab at his Austrian origins and lowly military rank. The insult stung, and Hitler sulked, but he didn't retreat. He knew patience was his ally. Behind the scenes, conservative politicians schemed. Franz von Papen, a former chancellor desperate to regain influence, convinced elites that Hitler could be boxed in if made chancellor with conservatives surrounding him. Others, like industrialists, were terrified of communism and saw the Nazis as a bulwark. They weren't buying sardines at rallies. They were buying into the fantasy that Hitler was a tool they could control. Historians still debate whether these conservatives truly believed they could tame him, or if they simply underestimated his cunning. Some argue they were arrogant, assuming their old networks of power would always dominate. Others say they were blinded by fear of the left. Either way, they opened the door. By late January 1933, the whispers became reality. Hindenburg, worn down by pressure and political paralysis, agreed to appoint Hitler as Chancellor. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler stood in Berlin, swearing the oath of office. Crowds cheered as torchlight parades filled the streets. For his followers, it was destiny fulfilled. For his enemies, it was the start of a nightmare. And yet pause for a cheeky note: if you'd asked some of the conservatives that night, they might have reassured you, "Don't worry, we've got him in a sardine tin, sealed tight. He can't wriggle out." Little did they know, they had opened the tin, and the stench was about to spread across Europe. The late 1920s had been a desert for the Nazi party line years, with little more than sardine tins and the occasional rural rally to sustain them. But when the Great Depression hit Germany after 1929, that desert suddenly bloomed into something far more dangerous. Factories shuttered, banks folded, and unemployment soared past 6 million. Families that once clung to middle-class respectability were now pawning wedding rings just to put potatoes on the table. And into this misery marched Adolf Hitler, offering not policy details, but something far more potent: certainty. Here's the mainstream fact. By the July 1932 Reichstag elections, the Nazi Party had exploded from a mere 12 seats in 1928 to 230 seats, making them the largest single party in Germany's parliament. In just 4 years, they had gone from fringe hecklers to a political powerhouse. The quirky detail: Nazi rallies in these years weren't just political meetings, they were theatrical productions. Imagine torchlit parades winding through German towns, drums pounding in rhythm, banners snapping in the wind. People came not just to hear speeches, but to experience belonging. At one rally, farmers showed up with pitchforks raised like medieval lances, as if attending both a harvest festival and a military muster. Political theater met village fair. Historians still argue about why the Nazis attracted so much support so quickly. Was it simply the Depression, making people desperate for anyone promising change? Or was it the Nazis' unique ability to fuse nationalism, fear of communism, and promises of unity into a single package? Some scholars argue that without the Depression, Hitler would have remained a footnote. Others claim his charisma and propaganda machine were always destined to resonate, crisis or not. One thing is clear: propaganda became the lifeblood of the movement. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazis' master of spin, orchestrated rallies, posters, and films with ruthless precision. He understood that politics was not about persuading the mind, but seizing the imagination. Posters showed Hitler as a man of destiny, a savior who could lift Germany from despair. Pamphlets promised jobs, strength, and order. The actual economic plans were vague at best, but the feeling they generated was powerful. And remember that sardine callback. In some rural areas, Nazi activists used to hand out small tins of sardines at rallies, stamped with swastika labels as quirky tokens of solidarity. They weren't particularly tasty campaign giveaways, but they were cheap and memorable. Imagine walking away from a fiery Hitler speech, clutching a tin of sardines, half laughing, half hypnotized. Hitler himself became the central focus. The party wasn't selling a platform so much as a person. His speeches blended rage, hope, and almost theatrical pauses that whipped crowds into frenzy. Accounts describe audiences weeping, fainting, even swearing lifelong loyalty on the spot. One observer said that hearing Hitler speak was like being carried on a river. You didn't know where you were going, but you couldn't resist. Yet behind the showmanship lay discipline. The Nazi Party built a nationwide network of local branches, each with youth groups, women's leagues, and veterans associations. It wasn't just a party, it was a subculture, a community where people could feel they belonged. For those humiliated by unemployment or disillusioned with Weimar politics, the sense of purpose was intoxicating. But the Nazis weren't the only extremists rising. The Communist Party also grew dramatically, fueled by working-class anger. Street clashes between Nazi stormtroopers and communist militias turned German cities into battlegrounds. Windows shattered, fists flew, and sometimes bullets did too. To ordinary Germans, democracy began to look less like stability and more like chaos. The middle ground shrank, squeezed between extremes. And here's a sardonic note. While Hitler raged against communism at rallies, his party sometimes borrowed tactics straight from the left. Soup kitchens, pamphlets, catchy slogans they were. Masters of imitation, wrapping right-wing nationalism in the packaging of mass politics. One historian quipped that the Nazis were like carnival barkers at a revolutionary fair, stealing the best tricks from every stall. Still, for all their growth, the Nazis weren't yet unstoppable. In November 1932, their support dipped slightly in elections, slipping from 230 seats to 196. Critics smirked that maybe the Nazi bubble was bursting. Maybe the fever was breaking. Hitler himself grew despondent, muttering that perhaps he'd missed his chance. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Germany might swerve away from disaster. But power often comes not just from popularity, but from deals made in smoky backrooms. Conservative elites, terrified of communism and convinced. March 23, 1933, the day of the Enabling Act, was the day the Weimar Republic effectively signed its own death certificate. Inside the Kroll Opera House, used as a temporary Reichstag building, after the fire the deputies raised their hands, many of them trembling, and gave Adolf Hitler the legal power to rule by decree. No more sardine tins rattling in smoky beer halls. No more begging for donations or pleading for attention. Hitler now had the machinery of an entire state at his disposal, dressed up in the illusion of legality. Here's the mainstream fact. The Enabling Act, passed with 444 votes in favor and only 94 against all from the Social Democrats. Every other party caved, either bullied into submission or convinced it was the safer choice. The communists weren't even present. They were either imprisoned or in hiding. Democracy collapsed, not with a dramatic gun battle, but with raised hands and hollow words of consent. The quirky detail. Outside the opera house during the vote, Nazi stormtroopers blasted patriotic songs from brass bands to drown out the voices of dissent. Deputies had to walk through a gauntlet of SA men chanting threats. It was intimidation dressed as carnival, and it worked. Historians still argue whether Hitler could have been stopped even then. Some say that if Hindenburg had refused to sign the bill, or if conservatives had shown real courage, the tide might have turned. Others argue that the momentum was too strong, that once the Reichstag fire had given Hitler the excuse to crush opponents, resistance became impossible. The debate remains unresolved, but the outcome is not. With the Enabling Act, Hitler became dictator in all but name. What followed was swift consolidation. Trade unions were dissolved. Opposition parties were banned. Local governments were taken over by Nazi appointees. Even cultural life bent under new rules, with un-German books thrown into bonfires and Jewish professionals purged from public life. The national community Hitler had dreamed about in Mein Kampf was being built, brick by brick, on the ruins of pluralism. And then came August 1934, when President Hindenburg died. Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer, leader of Germany. The army, once skeptical, swore an oath of personal loyalty to him. No sardine tin rattles now. This was orchestras, parades, and pledges broadcast by radio into every home. The transformation was complete. It's tempting to look back and see inevitability, the failed artist becoming dictator, the drifter turned chancellor, the fringe party turned regime. But history rarely runs on straight lines. At every step, there were moments where things could have gone differently, where he could have remained just another loud voice, lost in the chaos. That he didn't is a reminder of how fragile democracy can be when crises strike, and how dangerous it is to underestimate those who shout the loudest. Now, as promised, we slow things down, so here we are, at the close of our long journey from post-war chaos to the nightmarish birth of dictatorship. It's easy to feel unsettled, tracing the path of one man from obscurity to absolute power. But remember, you're safe, here in the quiet of your own space, listening not to marching boots, but to the soft hum of your fan or the stillness of your room. Let the tension slip away. The torches, the parades, the shouting, all of it belongs to another time, another place. Right now, the only flicker of light is whatever glows faintly in your room. Maybe a lamp, maybe the screen dimming down. Breathe slowly, letting each exhale feel a little heavier, as if you're setting down the burdens of the day like a rucksack at the end of a long march. It's worth remembering, too, that history doesn't just show us darkness, shows us resilience. For every shouting demagogue, there were quiet voices of courage, people who refused to bow, even when it cost them everything. Their stories may not be as loud, but they endure, like soft echoes, reminding us that not all paths lead into shadow. So as you drift toward rest, let those echoes guide you. Think less of the chaos and more of the stillness after a storm, when the air feels cleansed and the world is hushed. Tonight, you get to step away from history's noise, letting the rhythm of your own breath carry you gently forward. Close your eyes, let your thoughts soften, and know that you're safe, here. And now, the story has ended. The torches are gone, and what remains is only peace, quiet, and the promise of tomorrow. The appointment of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, was greeted by torchlight parades in Berlin, but in the back rooms of power, it was sold as a compromise. Conservative elites, smug in their belief they had contained him, imagined they were handing a noisy demagogue a ceremonial title while keeping the real levers of power in their own hands. Vice-Chancellor Franz von Papen assured doubters, "We've hired him, and we can fire him." Famous last words. Here's the mainstream fact. The Nazi Party didn't even have a majority when Hitler became Chancellor. In the November 1932 elections, their Reichstag seats had dropped to 196, down from 230 in July. Hitler wasn't swept in on a tidal wave. He was lifted into power by deals, bargains, and underestimation. The quirky detail, on the day of his swearing in, Hitler wore a surprisingly modest suit, not a military uniform. He knew symbolism mattered, and he wanted to look like a statesman rather than a revolutionary. Outside, however, the SA thundered through the streets in brown shirts, staging a massive torchlit parade past the Brandenburg Gate. The glow of thousands of flames lit up the night, casting long shadows on Berlin's buildings. To supporters, it felt like destiny arriving in firelight. To critics, it looked suspiciously like a funeral procession for democracy. Historians still argue about whether Hitler's rise was inevitable once he became chancellor. Was January 30th already the point of no return, or could events still have swerved another way? Some say the conservative elite could have clamped down if they'd acted decisively. Others argue that once Hitler had access to the machinery of state, his ruthlessness ensured nothing short of catastrophe could follow. In the early weeks of his chancellorship, Hitler moved cautiously, at least on the surface. He knew he needed to consolidate power before revealing the full extent of his ambitions. But he also wasted no time laying groundwork. The Reichstag was dissolved for new elections, scheduled for March 5, 1933. The Nazis launched a ferocious campaign, saturating the country with posters, parades, and radio broadcasts. Goebbels orchestrated it like a conductor, ensuring Hitler's image was everywhere, on banners, pamphlets, even matchbox labels. The message was simple: Hitler means strength, Hitler means order. And here's where our sardine callback sneaks in. During this campaign, some local Nazi branches gave out little sardine tins with labels that read "Germany First." It was a play on thrift, a wink at tough times. Imagine opening your pantry to find canned fish stamped with a swastika propaganda you could literally snack on. Then, on February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building burst into flames. Fire engulfed the chamber where German democracy lived. A Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, was arrested at the scene, half naked and coughing from smoke. The Nazis instantly blamed the communists, claiming it was the opening shot of a Marxist revolution. Historians still debate whether van der Lubbe acted alone, whether he was mentally unstable, or whether the Nazis themselves helped ignite the fire to justify a crackdown. The evidence is murky, the debate endless, but the effect was immediate. The very next day, Hitler persuaded Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree. Civil liberties, freedom of speech, press, and assembly were suspended. The police could now arrest anyone without trial. Thousands of communists, socialists, and critics were rounded up. Overnight, the Nazis turned a blaze into a political bonfire, burning away the last protections of democracy. When the March elections came, the Nazis still didn't win an outright majority, securing about 44% of the vote. But with their coalition partners, they held enough seats to dominate, and Hitler, ever the opportunist, pressed for more. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag gathered under heavy SA presence to vote on the Enabling Act. This law would transfer legislative power from Parliament to Hitler's cabinet for 4 years, effectively dismantling democracy with a single stroke. Inside the hall, intimidation was palpable. SA men lined the corridors. Communist deputies had already been banned or arrested, their seats empty. Only the Social Democrats dared oppose the bill. Their leader, Otto Wels, standing to declare, "You can take our freedom and our lives, but you cannot take our honor." Outside, stormtroopers jeered. Inside, the bill passed. From that moment, Hitler no longer needed sardine tins, beer halls, or backroom deals. He had the state itself.